Streetlights hummed softly, casting pale orange halos onto empty pavement. Storefronts were dark, windows reflecting only themselves. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then stopped, as if even it decided the night wasn't worth disturbing. This was the hour when the town felt suspended, no longer awake, not yet dreaming. A liminal space, thin and fragile. Inside a patrol car rolling slowly down Main Street, 3 police officers shared the quiet. Their radio crackled with low static, the kind that becomes background noise after years on the job. The engine idled gently at stop signs that no one else approached. The officers weren't chasing anything. They weren't responding to alarms. They were simply there, watching, passing time, doing what they had done hundreds of nights before. Routine has a sound. It's the soft click of a turn signal with no traffic around. The sigh of a thermos being set back into its cup holder. The casual, half-attentive exchanges over the radio. Codes and shorthand delivered without urgency. Familiar voices speaking because silence feels heavier when you're responsible for it. At 2:14 a.m., one of those voices checked in. The transmission was ordinary, too ordinary to remember, except for what followed it. A location update. A confirmation of patrol status. Nothing in the tone suggested fear or tension. No raised voice. No hesitation. Just another on a map being acknowledged. Then a pause. Not an alarming pause. Just long enough to be noticed by someone trained to listen for changes. A breath that didn't finish turning into a sentence. A faint sound in the background. Maybe wind, maybe movement, maybe nothing at all. And then the radio went quiet. At first, the silence meant nothing. Radios fall silent all the time. Conversations end. Officers get busy. Night patrols are full of gaps, moments when nothing needs to be said. The dispatcher waited, counted seconds without thinking about them, moved on to the next task. But minutes passed. The patrol car didn't check in again. By 2:21 a.m., the dispatcher tried to raise them. A simple call. Calm. Professional. The kind of call that assumes the answer will come immediately. It didn't. Static answered instead. That low, empty hiss that feels harmless until it doesn't. Another call followed. Then another. Each one slightly more deliberate than the last. Each unanswered. Somewhere between the third and fourth attempt, the room changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but the air tightened the way it does when a thought enters your mind that you don't want to finish forming. By 2:30-something, the exact minute would later be debated. The word missing had not yet been spoken, but everyone was thinking it. The patrol car was still transmitting a signal. Its GPS placed on a narrow stretch of road at the edge of town, a place most people only noticed when they were trying to leave. No reported incidents there. No scheduled stops. Just asphalt cutting through darkness. Backup units were dispatched quietly at first. No sirens. No rush. The assumption still clung to was mechanical failure, radio malfunction, maybe a routine traffic stop that hadn't been logged yet. But when the first unit arrived, the road was empty. No patrol car. No officers. No tire tracks veering off the road. No debris. No sign of a struggle. Just a stretch of pavement that looked exactly the way it always had. The GPS signal pulsed once more, then vanished. That was when the night officially stopped being ordinary. The absence was wrong. It didn't behave like chaos. It behaved like something deliberate. The kind of wrong that doesn't shout, but waits. The kind that makes professionals slow down instead of speeding up. More units arrived. Flashlights swept ditches and tree lines. Radios filled the darkness with overlapping voices, all trying to sound calm. The search widened in quiet increments, as if moving too fast might fracture something invisible. Still nothing. The officers were not new recruits. They were experienced, familiar with the area, with each other, with the rhythms of night patrol. They knew how to call for help. They knew how to leave signs behind. They knew what danger felt like. And yet, they had vanished without urgency, without noise, without evidence. As the hours stretched toward dawn, the night began to feel unnatural, not threatening, just hollow, like a stage after the actors have left, but the lights are still on. The sun rose eventually, indifferent and pale. Morning traffic began to use the same road where the patrol car had last been seen. People drove past without knowing they were passing to the center of a mystery that would outlive the town's memory of that day. By the time the news broke, the phrase last known contact had already been repeated enough times to lose its meaning. The final radio transmission was replayed, analyzed, slowed down, listened to by people who had never heard the voices before and would never hear them again. They searched for a panic in the tone, for coded warnings, for anything hidden between words. But the recording offered no drama, just normalcy cut short. That normalcy was what made it unbearable. Disasters usually announce themselves. Even accidents leave chaos behind. But this disappearance arrived gently, politely, as if it didn't want to draw attention to itself. 3 officers went on patrol that night. 3 officers never came home. And the space between those 2 facts refused to explain itself. Long after the radios were turned off and the search maps folded away, one question would linger like an echo in an empty room. How do 3 trained professionals disappear in silence? Without a trace, without a sound, without even the dignity of fear? The night never answered, and it never would. Morning arrived gently here, filtered through low hills and modest buildings that had learned how to age without changing much. The streets were narrow but familiar, shaped by decades of the same routines. Commuters leaving at the same time, shopkeepers unlocking doors with the same practiced twist of the wrist, neighbors waving without stopping. It was a place where patterns mattered, where nothing truly disappeared because everyone noticed when something was missing. This was a town built on recognition. People didn't introduce themselves with resumes or titles. They introduced themselves by reference. Someone's son, someone's former classmate, someone who used to work down at the mill before it closed. Trust wasn't earned through formality. It was inherited, reinforced, quietly renewed every day. And at the center of that trust sat the police. Not as an authority looming above the town, but as part of it. The officers didn't just patrol the streets. They inhabited them. They knew which porch lights were left on because an elderly resident forgot to turn them off. They knew which teenagers snuck out after midnight, and which ones were just walking home late from a friend's house. They knew which arguments were harmless and which silences were not. The 3 officers who vanished were woven into that fabric so completely that it was hard, later, to describe them as separate from the town itself. One of them had grown up only a few blocks from the station. He had once ridden his bike down the same streets he now patrolled in uniform, memorizing cracks in the sidewalk and shortcuts through alleys. When people saw him behind the wheel of a patrol car, they didn't think of enforcement. They thought of continuity, of someone who belonged. Another had come from just outside town, but had been adopted quickly, the way places like this adopt anyone willing to stay. He was known for talking too long at traffic stops, for asking questions that had nothing to do with licenses or registration. He remembered birthdays. He remembered stories people didn't expect him to remember. He treated the job less like a duty and more like a conversation that never quite ended. The 3rd was quieter, older, someone who had learned the town rather than grown from it. He had a reputation for steadiness, for being the one you wanted beside you when things got complicated. People trusted his silence because it never felt empty. It felt considered. They worked different shifts sometimes, different routes, but on that night, they shared the same patrol. Not because it was dangerous. Not because anything had gone wrong. Just because that was how the schedule fell. In towns like this, police officers aren't distant figures. They are present at school events, local parades, charity dinners. Their faces appear in community newsletters. Their names are spoken casually, without ceremony. Children grow up assuming they will always be there, standing at the edge of crowds, leaning against patrol cars, keeping watch without being asked. That assumption is fragile, though no one realizes it until it breaks. When the news spread that the officers were missing, the first reaction wasn't fear. It was disbelief. The kind that feels almost rude, as if the idea itself has violated some unspoken rule. Missing made sense when applied to hikers or travelers or strangers passing through. It did not make sense here. Not to these men. Not in this place. People gathered in small clusters that morning, outside the diner near the post office, in the parking lot of the grocery store. Conversations started with practical questions. Maybe the radio failed. Maybe they were assisting another department. Maybe the report was exaggerated. Someone would always say, "They'll turn up," and at first, everyone agreed. The families thought the same thing. Phones were checked repeatedly. Messages were reread. Small explanations filled the gaps: dead batteries, extended shifts, paperwork that ran long. There was comfort in routine even as it began to unravel. Spouses went about their mornings on autopilot, preparing breakfast that went untouched, setting aside mugs of coffee that grew cold. Children were sent to school with reassurances that felt more like promises and guesses. No one cried yet. Crying would have meant admitting that something truly wrong had happened. At the police station, familiarity worked against everyone. The missing officers' lockers were still there. Their mugs still sat where they always did. Jackets hung on hooks. Sleeves bent into shapes that looked almost human from a corner of the eye. Colleagues moved around these spaces carefully, as if bumping into them might erase something important. The town council called an emergency meeting, but it felt ceremonial, unnecessary. The real meeting was happening everywhere else, in kitchens on front lawns, in whispered conversations that ended abruptly when someone walked too close. As hours passed, the town began to feel exposed. The absence of 3 officers wasn't just emotional. It was structural. Patrol schedules were rewritten. Backup was called in from neighboring areas. Strangers in unfamiliar uniforms began driving streets they didn't yet understand. People noticed. Trust doesn't vanish all at once. It thins. It stretches. It becomes something people are careful with. By afternoon, the phrase, "if it could happen to them," began to surface, unspoken but heavy. If officers who knew every road and every face could disappear, then safety itself felt negotiable. And yet, the town resisted panic. Search efforts were supported instinctively. Volunteers brought food. Local businesses closed early so employees could help. Farmers offered land access without being asked. This was still a place that believed in collective responsibility, in the idea that problems could be solved by showing up. But beneath that unity was something more fragile, a shared understanding that the town's identity was shifting, even if no one knew into what. The officers had represented more than law enforcement. They represented permanence, the idea that something stayed the same no matter what else changed. Now, with their absence pressing into every corner, the town was being forced to imagine itself without that anchor. Night fell again, and the streets felt different. Lights were turned on earlier. Doors were locked more deliberately. People listened to sounds they had ignored their entire lives. The town hadn't become dangerous overnight, but it had become uncertain. And uncertainty is louder than sirens. The trust that had once felt effortless now required effort. Reassurance had to be spoken aloud. Familiar routes were reconsidered. Small freedoms were paused, just in case. No one said it openly, but everyone felt it. Something had been taken, and not just 3 lives. A sense of order had slipped through the cracks, leaving behind a question that refused to be answered by community or kindness alone. The town would keep moving, because towns always do. But from that day forward, it would do so with an awareness it had never needed before. That safety once assumed could vanish quietly, just like 3 officers on a routine night patrol. Earlier that evening, the officers had signed in, checked their equipment, and reviewed the same kind of briefing they had heard countless times before. Weather was clear. No major incidents reported. A few routine calls logged from the previous shift. Noise complaints, a broken streetlight, a car left idling too long outside a closed business. Nothing that lingered in the mind. The town slipped into night gradually. Dusk softened the edges of buildings, and by the time darkness settled fully, the streets had thinned to almost nothing. This was the hour patrol officers knew best. Not the dramatic moments people imagined, but the quiet stretch where vigilance became a kind of meditation. The patrol car moved steadily, its headlights gliding over familiar landmarks. A closed hardware store. A playground empty, except for the wind stirring loose gravel. A row of houses where porch lights clicked off one by one as families surrendered to sleep. Inside the car, Conversation drifted in and out. It wasn't about work, not really. It was about ordinary things. Weekend plans, a story someone had heard earlier that day, a half-finished thought that didn't need a conclusion. Years of working together had stripped away the need to fill every silence. They understood the rhythm of one another's presence. Every so often, the radio broke with a call from dispatch, a time check, a confirmation of location. Each response came back calm and automatic. The officers' voices carried no tension, no distraction. They sounded exactly the way they always did. Their route took them to the heart of town, and then outward, toward the edges where streetlights grew sparse and the dark pressed closer to the road. This wasn't unusual. Night patrol often meant circling the perimeter, making sure nothing had wandered in or out unnoticed. At one point, the car slowed near a side street that cut away from the main road, leading toward undeveloped land. One of the officers glanced down it briefly, more out of habit than concern. Nothing moved. The darkness remained intact. They continued on. Time, in those hours, behaved strangely. Minutes stretched, then collapsed. The patrol car crossed the same intersections again, the same landmarks reappearing with slight variations depending on the angle of the light. Familiarity bred a sense of insulation, as if the night itself had rules that could be relied upon. But small things began to shift. The first was so minor it almost didn't register. A missed check-in window. Not a full absence, just a delay. Dispatch noted it, but did not escalate. Officers sometimes ran late on reports. Sometimes they were handling something that didn't warrant immediate radio traffic. When the check-in came, it was normal. Too normal. The officer's voice didn't explain the delay, but it didn't need to. Routine absorbed the anomaly and moved on. Later, the patrol car altered its route slightly. Not dramatically, just a turn that wasn't typical for that hour. The GPS would later show it lingering on a stretch of road that didn't usually require attention. There were no businesses open there, no residences close enough to warrant concern. Just asphalt bordered by trees and open land. No call preceded the deviation. No incident report followed it. The radio captured fragments of conversation around that time. Background noise, a faint sound that could have been wind brushing against a microphone or a door opening and closing somewhere nearby. Analysts would later listen to those seconds repeatedly, hoping to hear intention where there was only ambiguity. Inside the car, something may have drawn their attention, or nothing at all. That is the cruelty of reconstruction. It demands meaning from moments that were never meant to be preserved. The patrol slowed, then stopped. The engine idled. The headlights illuminated a narrow stretch of road that led forward into darkness and backward into everything they knew. For reasons that would never be fully understood, they stayed there longer than expected. Dispatch called again, casual at first, a location check. The response came back delayed but calm. The officer identified their position, though it didn't fully align with where dispatch believed them to be. The discrepancy was noted, then dismissed. Night patrol required trust. Trust that officers knew what they were doing. Trust that silence meant focus, not danger. Minutes passed. The patrol car remained stationary. If someone had been watching from a distance, they would have seen nothing remarkable. A police vehicle parked at the side of a quiet road. No flashing lights. No movement. No signs of distress. Then the final transmission. It wasn't a call for help. It wasn't a warning. It was a partial thought. Something that sounded like the beginning of an explanation or a routine update. The voice was steady, unhurried, almost distracted, and then it ended, not with a cut or a burst of static, but with a fading that suggested interruption rather than impact, as if something had drawn the speaker's attention away mid-sentence. The patrol car's signal continued to transmit for a short time afterward, as if the vehicle itself hadn't yet realized it was alone. The radio channel remained open, empty, waiting. Dispatch tried to reestablish contact. Once, twice. The tone of the calls shifted subtly, still professional, but more deliberate. Each unanswered call added weight to the silence. Eventually, protocol took over. Backup units were directed to the location. The assumption remained that something mundane had gone wrong. A mechanical issue, a distraction, a misunderstanding. But when the first unit arrived, the assumptions began to fracture. The road was empty, not abandoned in a dramatic way, just empty. The patrol car was gone. The officers were gone. The night had closed over itself, leaving no indication that anything had ever disturbed it. Tire tracks were absent. Footprints were non-existent. The ground at the roadside showed no signs of struggle, no broken branches, no scuffed earth. The darkness felt undisturbed, almost pristine. It was as if the patrol had never been there at all. Investigators would later mark this moment as the point where the case stopped behaving like a typical disappearance. People get lost. Vehicles crash. Accidents leave evidence. Even intentional acts usually leave something behind. Here, there was nothing. The timeline collapsed inward on itself. Each minute that followed the last radio call became heavier than the one before. Questions multiplied without answers to anchor them. Why that road? Why that moment? Why no call for assistance? The patrol had not been rushed. They had not been cornered. They had not even sounded concerned. The night patrol had simply ended. As dawn approached, the reconstruction of those final hours would begin in earnest. Maps spread across tables, times circled and underlined. But no amount of analysis could restore the missing minutes between normalcy and disappearance. Those minutes belonged to the night now, and the night, it seemed, was not giving them back. By the time the sun fully cleared the horizon, the search was already behind schedule. Not because anyone had failed to act, but because the situation refused to declare itself. Disappearances demand a starting point, a wreck, a call for help, a last confirmed sighting that feels solid enough to build outward from. Here, there was only an empty stretch of road, and a time stamp that led nowhere. Still, procedure moved forward. Officers arrived in quiet waves, their vehicles lining the roadside in careful formation. Flashing lights were used sparingly, as if too much brightness might erase something fragile. Radios buzzed with low, controlled voices, each one trying to sound certain in a landscape that offered none. Search grids were established, though no one could say with confidence what they were searching for. Teams moved outward from the last known location, scanning ditches, tree lines, culverts. Every patch of disturbed earth drew attention. Every broken twig was examined, turned over, dismissed. The ground, however, refused to cooperate. It lay undisturbed, as if nothing heavier than wind had passed through. 9 units were brought in mid-morning. The dogs worked with focus that felt almost hopeful, noses pressed to asphalt and dirt, handlers watching for any sign of interest. For a moment, it seemed possible, inevitable even, that the animals would pick up a scent and pull the search in a direction that made sense. But the dogs hesitated. They circled. They doubled back. They sniffed the same areas repeatedly without committing to a trail. It was as if the scent had been cut cleanly, removed rather than faded. Handlers exchanged looks that said more than words ever could. A helicopter was deployed by late morning, its presence announced long before it appeared. The low thrum of its blades rolled over the town, drawing people out onto porches and into streets. From above, fields and woods were scanned for anomalies. Flattened grass, disturbed soil, anything that might suggest movement or concealment. Nothing surfaced. The aerial view only reinforced what was becoming painfully clear on the ground. There was no obvious direction to follow. By noon, the search had grown beyond law enforcement. Volunteers gathered at staging areas, signing in, pulling on gloves, accepting instructions with seriousness that bordered on reverence. Farmers opened gates. Landowners pointed out wells, old sheds, forgotten drainage paths. The town was offering itself piece by piece, convinced that effort alone could produce answers. Emotionally, the day balanced on a fragile edge. There was urgency, but not panic, determination, but not despair. Everyone behaved as if the officers were just beyond the next tree line, waiting to be found. That belief sustained the search, gave it energy. But time has a way of eroding optimism without announcing its intentions. As hours passed and nothing changed, fatigue began to creep in. Not physical exhaustion, but a deeper weariness. The kind that comes from repeating the same motion, without result. Eyes scanned the ground automatically now. Conversations thinned. The quiet between radio calls stretched longer. Somewhere in the afternoon, someone finally said the word vanished out loud. It landed heavily, not as a conclusion, but as an admission. Investigators began to adjust their thinking, even if they didn't say so publicly. Scenarios were reconsidered. Could the officers have left the area voluntarily? Could they have been lured away from their vehicle? Could the patrol car itself have been moved without leaving traces? Each question raised another that had no answer. By evening, the search radius expanded. Checkpoints were set up on roads leading out of town. Nearby jurisdictions were notified. Descriptions of the patrol car were circulated, though no one could agree on when it had last been seen by anyone outside the officers themselves. Witnesses came forward hesitantly. Someone thought they had seen headlights in an unusual place. Someone else recalled hearing an engine late at night. Each tip was logged carefully, investigated thoroughly, and ultimately led nowhere. The lack of evidence became its own presence. In most searches, you move from chaos toward clarity. Here, it felt like clarity was being actively withheld. The landscape offered no resistance, no clues to argue with. It simply existed, unchanged. As night fell again, floodlights were set up near the original location, illuminating the roadside with an artificial brightness that felt almost intrusive. Shadows stretched unnaturally, creating shapes that invited interpretation and then denied it. Searchers worked into the night, driven more by refusal than hope. The idea of stopping, of admitting that the first day had failed, felt unbearable. Families waited nearby, though not all of them wanted to be there. Some clung to the activity, believing that proximity might somehow bring answers closer. Others stayed home, staring at phones that refused to ring, imagining scenarios they immediately pushed away. By the second morning, the tone had shifted. The search continued, but something essential had changed. The assumption that the officers were alive, simply lost or delayed, could no longer be sustained without effort. It hadn't disappeared, but it now existed alongside other, darker possibilities. Media arrived, their presence both expected and resented. Cameras captured images of search teams and flashing lights, compressing a complex reality into frames that suggested action, progress. Headlines spoke of mystery and concern, but offered no substance. Behind the scenes, investigators were grappling with an absence that defied experience. Even deliberate disappearances leave traces: financial activity, communications, preparations. Here, there was nothing to suggest planning or intent. The officer's patrol car remained missing, its absence echoing louder than any abandoned vehicle ever could. Without it, the disappearance felt incomplete, unresolved in a way that made conventional explanations feel inadequate. By the end of the third day, the search was scaled back. Not because anyone believed the officers would not be found, but because the landscape had given up everything it had to offer. Continuing at the same intensity would have meant pretending that effort alone could replace evidence. The announcement was made carefully, with words chosen to soften the blow. Transitioning to an investigative phase. Refocusing resources. Phrases designed to suggest progress without promising it. For the town, it felt like something closing. The roads reopened. The floodlights were taken down. Volunteers returned home, carrying with them the quiet discomfort of having searched everywhere and found nothing. What remained was a hollow center, a place where answers should have been. The search had not failed in the traditional sense. It had been thorough, relentless, supported by an entire community. And yet it had revealed nothing. The officers were still gone. The night still held its secret, and the town was left staring at a question that no amount of searching had managed to move even an inch. In the days after the search slowed, the town found itself suspended between what it knew and what it needed to believe. The absence of answers created a vacuum, and into that space poured speculation. Quiet at first and louder, then impossible to ignore. People spoke in lowered voices, as if the truth might be listening. Theories began the way rumors always do, cautiously, almost apologetically. Someone would start a sentence with, "I'm probably wrong, but," or, "This might sound crazy." The phrases acted like shields, giving permission to say the unsayable. At the diner, Over half-finished cups of coffee, one idea surfaced again and again. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe the patrol car veered off the road into water somewhere unseen. Maybe they were injured, trapped, waiting. That theory felt merciful. It allowed for survival. It gave the search a direction that didn't require betrayal of trust. But maps were consulted. Rivers were dragged. Ponds were checked and rechecked. No vehicle surfaced. No sign of impact emerged. The accident theory weakened, then quietly retreated. Another idea took its place. What if the officers had been involved in something they shouldn't have been? The thought arrived reluctantly, wrapped in discomfort. It contradicted everything the town believed about them. But once spoken, it was difficult to put back. People revisited small moments from the past, conversations that had felt insignificant at the time. A late-night call that seemed unusual. A patrol route change that now looked deliberate. Details were rearranged, not because they fit, but because people needed them to. The suggestion of corruption spread unevenly. Some dismissed it outright, offended by the implication. Others entertained it in private, wrestling with the guilt of doubt. The town's trust in its officers had been deep, but trust, when shaken, can fracture unpredictably. Families felt this tension acutely. Spouses and parents found themselves defending the officers not just from the outside world, but from the creeping uncertainty within themselves. They replayed conversations, searching for clues they might have missed. They asked questions they hated themselves for asking. Would he have told me if something was wrong? Did I notice him acting differently? Was there something he was carrying alone? The answers never settled. As official statements remained measured and sparse, unofficial narratives gained traction. Some people believed the officers had stumbled upon something, an operation, a secret, something hidden just beneath the surface of the town's quiet life. The idea was cinematic, dramatic, and unsettling. It suggested that danger had been present all along, unseen but watching. Others took the theory further, whispering about organized crime, about connections that reached beyond the town's borders. The lack of evidence made the idea hard to dismiss. When nothing is known, everything feels possible. Each theory reframed the disappearance in a new emotional light. Accident brought hope. Corruption brought betrayal. Conspiracy brought fear. None brought peace. Law enforcement tried to counter speculation with facts, but facts were in short supply. Press conferences emphasized what was not known as much as what was. Investigators asked for patience, for trust in the process. Patience is difficult when grief has no shape. The families existed in a state of emotional suspension. Without bodies, there was no mourning in the traditional sense. Without answers, there was no closure. They lived in the space between hope and despair, adjusting their beliefs day by day, sometimes hour by hour. Some clung fiercely to the idea that the officers were alive, held somewhere against their will. Others allowed themselves to imagine darker outcomes, then recoiled from the pain those thoughts caused. Arguments emerged quietly, not shouting matches, but subtle disagreements over interpretation. One family member might believe one theory wholeheartedly, while another rejected it completely. Love did not shield them from doubt. It amplified it. In the wider community, the disappearance began to reflect personal fears. Those who had always mistrusted authority leaned into theories of corruption and cover-ups. Those who valued order and stability favored explanations that preserved the integrity of the institution. The mystery became a mirror, showing people parts of themselves they hadn't examined before. Online forums and call-in radio shows amplified the noise. Strangers weighed in with confidence, offering explanations built on incomplete information and certainly unburdened by emotional connection. The officers' names became content, their lives reduced to bullet points and speculation. The town watched this from a distance, uncomfortable with how quickly the story no longer felt like theirs. Investigators followed up on every credible lead, no matter how unlikely. Tips poured in, anonymous calls, letters, sightings reported from other states. Each one carried a surge of hope, followed by the familiar drop when it led nowhere. Theories rose and fell like tides. What remained constant was the ache of not knowing. As weeks turned into months, the initial unity of the town began to strain. The shared mission of finding the officers gave way to differing beliefs about what had happened to them. People stopped agreeing on which questions mattered most. Was it more important to believe in the officers, or to find the truth at any cost? The question went unanswered, but it shaped conversations, relationships, even friendships. Long-held assumptions were challenged. Silence grew in places where there had once been easy conversation. Through it all, the officers remained absent but present, spoken of constantly, imagined endlessly, but never seen. Their disappearance had become more than a case. It was an unresolved story that refused to settle into a single version. And as the theories multiplied, one truth became increasingly clear. The longer the mystery remained unsolved, the more it would belong to everyone and to no one at all. In the early months, every day felt urgent, heavy with the possibility that something might finally break open. Investigators arrived each morning, expecting the call that would change everything. Families woke up bracing for news, good or bad, because even bad news felt preferable to silence. The town stayed alert, listening. Then, gradually, the rhythm shifted. Lead began to slow, not all at once, but in subtle ways that were easy to overlook. Fewer calls came in overnight. Fewer tips carried the sharp edge of plausibility. The investigators' whiteboards filled with timelines and names, but no new arrows were added. The case files grew thicker, but not deeper. Meetings continued, but they changed in tone. Early on, discussions had been animated, driven by optimism and tension. Now, they became methodical, almost procedural. Evidence was reviewed again, not because it promised revelation, but because repetition felt safer than admitting stagnation. The disappearance did not become less important. It became less active. For law enforcement, this was the most dangerous phase of any investigation. Not the chaos at the beginning, but the quiet middle, where attention naturally drifts. New cases demanded resources. Emergencies arose elsewhere. The missing officers remained a priority on paper, but paper does not feel absence the way people do. Detectives rotated off the case. Some were promoted, others transferred. Each transition required a retelling of the story, a fresh set of ears trying to absorb years of uncertainty in hours. Details lost their emotional weight as they were passed along, becoming data instead of memory. The original investigators carried something different, a sense of personal failure that never quite resolved. They remembered the early days vividly, the urgency, the belief that answers were close. Watching the case stall felt like watching a door slowly close, inch by inch, without ever slamming shut. The families noticed a change before anyone told them. Phone calls came less frequently. Updates became vaguer. Where once there had been specific actions, searches planned, leads followed, there were now reassurances. We're still working on it. Nothing new to report. Phrases designed to comfort, but which instead highlighted the absence of progress. Hope did not disappear, but it transformed. It became quieter, more cautious. Families stopped expecting answers on specific days. Birthdays passed. Anniversaries came and went. Each milestone marked time not just since the disappearance, but since the last meaningful development. Grief without resolution behaves differently than grief with an ending. There is no moment of acceptance, no clear line between before and after. Instead, there's a constant recalibration, learning how to live while carrying uncertainty like an extra weight. Some family members held on to hope with ferocity, refusing to let the case slip into obscurity. They called investigators. They spoke to the media. They organized vigils and awareness events, even as attendance slowly declined. Others retreated inward. The emotional labor of maintaining hope became too heavy. It was easier, in some ways, to imagine an ending than to live indefinitely without one. The town, too, began to move on, not because it wanted to, but because time insisted. New families moved in. Children who had been too young to understand the disappearance grew up hearing about it as a story rather than a lived experience. Businesses changed hands. Buildings were renovated or demolished. Physical reminders of the early days faded. The road where patrol had last been seen remained, of course, but it no longer drew attention. People drove it without thinking. Life reasserted itself quietly without apology. Media interest waned. Headlines gave way to brief mentions, then to anniversary pieces that summarized years of mystery in a few paragraphs. The disappearance became categorized as cold, a word that sounded clinical and final, even though nothing had been resolved. Cold cases do not feel cold to people left behind. For them, the absence remained immediate. Chairs stayed empty at family gatherings. Photographs aged while the people in them did not. The officers existed in a suspended state, neither alive nor dead, neither present nor gone. Investigators, when they revisited the case, did so with fresh eyes but limited tools. Technology advanced. Databases expanded. Old evidence was re-examined with new methods, but there was little to work with. No physical trace meant no DNA to test, no objects to reanalyze. The case resisted modernization. Occasionally, a new tip would surface, someone claiming to have seen the officers years later, or to know someone who knew something. These moments reignited hope briefly, only to extinguish it again when the lead dissolved under scrutiny. Each false spark left a residue of disappointment. Some in law enforcement began to speak of the case in the past tense, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. Language shifted subtly. They were, at the time, words that implied an ending no one had officially acknowledged. The families noticed. They corrected it when they could. They carried the weight of that correction alone. By the time decade had passed, the disappearance had become part of the town's identity, though rarely discussed openly. It was referenced obliquely in conversations about safety or in moments when the past surfaced unexpectedly. There was a collective understanding that the case had not been solved, not because of negligence or lack of care, but because some mysteries simply resist resolution. And yet, resistance did not equal acceptance. The files remained. The evidence, sparse as it was, stayed cataloged. The officers' names remained active in databases, never officially closed. The case existed in a state of suspended animation, preserved but unmoving. Time continued its quiet work, wearing down edges, softening memories, creating distance. But beneath that erosion, the unanswered questions remained intact. They waited, and in waiting, they gathered a different kind of weight. One measured not in urgency, but in endurance. The case was cold now, by definition. But cold did not mean forgotten. It meant waiting for something, anything, that might finally disturb the silence time had settled so carefully over the truth. 37 years is long enough for a town to forget the sound of its own past. The streets still carried the same names, but they no longer carried the same weight. Buildings had been repainted, repurposed, or erased entirely. What had once been the edge of town was now bordered by new development, and what had once felt isolated now sat quietly between places people passed without noticing. Time had done what it always does. It rearranged meaning. For those who had lived through the disappearance, memory became selective, not because they wanted it to be, but because survival demanded it. Details that once felt vivid softened at the edges. Conversations blurred together. The exact sequence of those early days grew harder to reconstruct with certainty. But absence does not fade the way memories do. The officers remained suspended in a strange, unmoving place. Their faces still appeared in old photographs, Uniged, forever caught in expressions that belonged to another era, haircuts that marked the decade, uniforms that no longer matched current designs, smiles frozen before history intervened. For the families, the passage of time was not linear. It folded in on itself. Birthdays continued to arrive, but they no longer represented celebration. They marked distance. Each one widened the gap between the age the officers had been when they disappeared and the age they would have been now. The arithmetic became impossible to ignore. Children grew up, some with only fragments of memory, blurred images of a parent's voice, a familiar laugh they could no longer place. Others had no memory at all, only stories told so often they felt inherited. They learned who their fathers were through photographs, through anecdotes, through the careful language of adults trying not to burden them with pain. They learned how to answer questions from classmates who discovered the story later and didn't know how to ask about it gently. For spouses, the years carried a different weight. Legally, they existed in a gray space for a long time, unable to grieve fully, unable to move forward without guilt. Life demanded decisions, careers, homes, relationships. Each choice felt like a betrayal of someone who might still be out there. Somewhere, some remarried eventually. Others never did. There was no right way to live with an unresolved disappearance, only the way that allowed breathing to continue. The town changed its rhythms. New officers joined the department who had not been alive when the disappearance occurred. They learned the case the way one learns history, not as something lived, but as something studied. The story was presented during training, framed as a reminder of uncertainty, of vigilance, of respect for the unknown. For them, the missing officers were names on plaques, not colleagues. That distance was not indifference. It was inevitability. The case file sat in storage, carefully preserved. Boxes labeled with dates that felt increasingly abstract. Paper yellowed, ink faded, but the contents remained intact, waiting for eyes that might see something differently. Every few years, someone would revisit the case publicly. An anniversary article, a short documentary, a podcast episode framed around unresolved mysteries. Each retelling compressed decades of waiting into an hour or less, often ending with the same unanswered questions. The families watched these retellings with mixed emotions, gratitude for attention, frustration at oversimplification, pain at seeing deeply personal loss turned into narrative. Still, attention mattered. Silence felt worse. The town, meanwhile, learned how to carry the story without letting it dominate daily life. It became part of the background, acknowledged but not examined, like an old scar no longer tender to the touch. People spoke of it in the past tense, even though nothing had been resolved. That thing that happened. Back then, language created distance where certainty could not. Yet every so often, something would disrupt that distance. A construction project would unearth something old, a foundation, a forgotten utility line. And for a moment, imagination would run ahead of reality. Could this be connected? Could something hidden finally be surfacing? Each time, the answer was no. The land gave up many secrets over the years, but not that one. As technology advanced, there were renewed efforts to re-examine the disappearance. Databases were cross-referenced. Old tips were digitized. Patterns were searched for algorithmically. But technology requires data, and the case had always been defined by its lack. What could not be measured, however, was the psychological imprint the disappearance left behind. For those who remembered, the night never fully released its hold. It lingered in the way people locked their doors, in the way they reacted to unexpected silence. It existed in the collective subconscious, shaping behavior without demanding acknowledgement. For those who came later, the story carried a different tone. It was less personal, more mythic. A cautionary tale whispered among teenagers daring each other to drive down certain roads at night. A local legend stripped of its original grief. That transformation hurt the families more than they admitted, because myth implies resolution of a sort, an ending shaped by imagination, if not by fact. The families did not want imagination. They wanted truth, and truth had been absent for 37 years. Then, without warning, the silence shifted. It did not announce itself dramatically. There was no confession, no long-awaited tip from a guilty conscience. Instead, it arrived through bureaucracy, through paperwork, through a line item on a development plan, through the mundane processes of progress. Land on the outskirts of town was being evaluated for sale. Surveys were conducted. Equipment rolled in. The ground, long ignored, was about to be disturbed. At first, no one connected this to the past. Why would they? The disappearance had taught the town not to expect revelations. Hope had learned to be cautious. But when the survey data revealed inconsistencies, structures that did not appear on any official records, attention sharpened. Old maps were consulted. Permits were checked. No explanation emerged. The discovery did not yet have a shape. It was only an anomaly, a suggestion that something existed where nothing was supposed to be. For investigators who still carried the case quietly in the backs of their minds, something stirred. A sensation long forgotten. The feeling that the past might not be as sealed as it seemed. Word traveled carefully at first. No announcements. No press releases. Just phone calls and emails exchanged between people who understood the weight of what this might mean. The families were not told immediately. They had learned the cost of premature hope, but the ground had been marked. And for the first time in nearly 4 decades, the town felt something it had almost forgotten how to recognize. Anticipation, not certainty, not belief, just a fragile, unsettling awareness that the silence might not be finished speaking yet. The land had always been quiet in the way forgotten places are quiet. It sat just beyond the parts of town that people named in directions, a stretch of ground passed rather than visited. Over the years, it had been used for different things. Grazing once, storage later, then nothing at all. Grass grew unevenly. Trees clustered where they pleased. There were no signs warning people away, because there had never seemed to be anything worth protecting. When the surveyors arrived, they expected monotony. Their work was technical, procedural, and detached from history. Instruments were calibrated. Coordinates were logged. Measurements were taken not to uncover the past, but to prepare the future. If anything was expected to be found, it was debris, old pipes, foundations from long-demolished structures, maybe a forgotten well. What they did not expect was resistance. The first anomaly appeared as a subtle irregularity in the readings. Nothing dramatic, just a density where density should not have been. The kind of thing that usually resolved itself once equipment was recalibrated or data rechecked. But it didn't. Additional scans were run. The numbers repeated themselves with stubborn consistency. Something solid existed beneath the surface, something large enough to alter the ground behavior, yet absent from every record the surveyors had access to. At first, it was treated as an inconvenience. Work paused while supervisors were notified. Old property documents were pulled. Maps were layered over maps. Decades of zoning changes were reviewed. There was no mention of any structure in that location. No permits. No construction records. No indication that anything had ever been built there at all. The ground, it seemed, was keeping a secret. Excavation was approved cautiously. No one wanted to damage unknown infrastructure, and no one wanted to create problems where none were expected. The first cuts into the soil were shallow, careful, almost apologetic. Metal struck metal sooner than anticipated. The sound traveled differently than expected. Duller, heavier, resonant in a way that suggested thickness. Not scrap, not debris. Something deliberate. Work stopped again. By the time investigators were notified, the discovery had already begun to feel wrong. Not dangerous. Just misaligned with expectation. Structures underground usually announce themselves through context. Near old facilities, former military land, industrial zones. This was none of those things. Law enforcement approached the site with a restraint shaped by experience. The disappearance of the officers had taught the town not to assume significance too quickly. Still, the coincidence was impossible to ignore. An unrecorded underground structure, located within a radius that overlapped uncomfortably with the last known patrol area. It demanded attention. Excavation resumed under supervision. Soil was removed layer by layer, revealing a flat surface beneath. Concrete, aged but intact. No collapse. No obvious damage. Just a roof, waiting. There was no signage. No ventilation shafts visible from the surface. No obvious access point. Whoever had built it had not intended it to be found. As more of the structure was exposed, its shape became clearer, rectangular, purposeful, too large to be incidental, too concealed to be benign. Measurements suggested depth, enough to suggest protection, concealment, longevity. The word bunker surfaced quietly, tentatively. It carried weight, even when spoken softly. Before any attempt was made to breach the structure, the area was secured. Procedures were followed. Specialists were consulted. The past had taught everyone involved that haste could be costly. Still, the waiting was electric. For those involved in the discovery, there was an acute awareness that they were standing at the edge of something unresolved. Even if the structure proved unrelated, its existence challenged a long-held belief that everything worth knowing about the disappearance had already been uncovered. The entrance was not obvious. It did not present itself with doors or hatches. It was concealed beneath layers of concrete and soil designed to mimic the surrounding ground. When it was finally located, it felt less like opening something and more like uncovering it from intention. The seal was intact. Time had not weakened it in any meaningful way. The materials used were industrial, durable, chosen for permanence. Tools were required. Care was taken. Each movement felt deliberate, weighted by the knowledge that whatever lay beneath had been waiting decades for light. When the seal was broken, air escaped slowly. It was not dramatic. No rush. No sound that could be described as cinematic. Just a faint shift, a subtle release, as if the structure itself exhaled after holding its breath for years. The opening revealed a ladder descending into darkness. Lights were lowered first. Cameras followed. The beam of illumination cut through dust and shadow, revealing walls that were smooth, reinforced, intentional. This was not a shelter thrown together in haste. It was planned, constructed with expertise. The first person to descend did so carefully, step by step, aware that the path would be unstable when disturbed. At the bottom, the space opened up. The bunker was larger than expected. Not cavernous, but substantial. Rooms branched off from a central corridor. Electrical wiring lined the walls. Some fixtures remained intact, though long inactive. The air was stale but breathable. There were signs of use. Not recent, but not ancient either. Footprints preserved in dust. Equipment arranged rather than abandoned. Shelving units. Some empty, some holding objects that resisted immediate identification. There were no bodies. That fact landed heavily. For years, the unspoken expectation had been that discovery would mean resolution, that something hidden would finally explain absence through finality. But the bunker offered no such simplicity. Instead, it offered implication. Inside, investigators cataloged everything meticulously. Every object was photographed, documented, left undisturbed until its context could be understood. There were tools, specialized, not improvised. Communication equipment, outdated but functional for its time. Storage containers bearing no labels. And there were signs of habitation. Not comfort, not domesticity, but presence. Chairs positioned for use. Bedding folded, not discarded. Evidence that people had been there deliberately, not briefly. The question was no longer whether the bunker mattered. It was how. As word spread. Carefully, selectively, the town felt the shift immediately. The story, long dormant, surged back into relevance with a force that surprised even those who had never stopped thinking about it. The families were notified privately. No details at first. Just the acknowledgement that something significant had been found, that the case was active again, that the ground had yielded something it had hidden for decades. Reactions varied. Some felt hope ignite instantly, bright and dangerous. Others felt dread. Discovery did not guarantee answers. It only guaranteed change. Media arrived quickly this time, drawn by the gravity of the word bunker. Speculation reignited, louder and more confident than before. Theories that had once seemed excessive now felt plausible. Why was it there? Who built it? Who used it? And most importantly, what did it have to do with 3 officers who vanished without a trace? Investigators worked under pressure they had not felt in years. Every decision carried consequence. The temptation to draw conclusions was strong, but resisted. They knew better now. Initial analysis suggested the bunker had been constructed around the time of the disappearance, or earlier. The materials matched. The technology aligned. Nothing inside dated it conclusively, but nothing contradicted the possibility either. Records were searched again, this time with different eyes. Contractors, suppliers, unusual permits, gaps where documentation should have existed. Patterns began to form, faint but undeniable. The bunker was not random. It was not forgotten, because it had never been known. It had been designed to exist in parallel with the town, unseen and unacknowledged. As investigators stood inside it, surrounded by concrete walls that held their silence for nearly 4 decades, one realization settled heavily over everyone involved. This was not a place of accident. It was a place of intention. An intention once uncovered, demanded answers that the town had waited 37 years to ask again. What the bunker revealed was not what anyone had prepared themselves to see. There is a strange comfort in finality, even when it is painful. For decades, many had carried the quiet expectation that if the truth ever surfaced, it would arrive in a definitive form, something concrete enough to end the waiting. Bones, personal effects, a clear narrative that explained how 3 lives had ended. Grief, at least, would have had a shape. Instead, the bunker offered something far more unsettling. It offered evidence without conclusion. As investigators moved deeper into the structure, the absence of bodies became impossible to ignore. Every room was examined carefully, every corner illuminated, every shadow challenged. There were no hidden compartments containing remains, no sealed chambers, no obvious signs of violence frozen in time. The space was not empty, but it was selectively so. Objects inside the bunker spoke quietly of purpose, not chaos, not panic. There were no overturned tables, no damaged walls, no marks suggesting a struggle. The environment felt controlled, almost disciplined. Whoever had occupied the space had done so deliberately and had left it deliberately as well. That detail alone reshaped the entire case. If the officers had been taken there, it had not been in a moment of uncontrolled violence. If they had entered on their own, it had not been by accident. The bunker did not feel like a place where things happened suddenly. It felt like a place designed for things to unfold over time. Investigators cataloged everything slowly, aware that meaning might hide in the smallest detail. The communication equipment was among the most unsettling finds. Radios, hardwired systems, components that suggested the ability to monitor or communicate beyond the bunker itself. None were active anymore, but their presence raised questions that had never been asked seriously before. Was someone listening that night? Had the officers been heard long before they vanished? There were maps pinned to one wall, their paper brittle with age. At first glance, they appeared generic, topographical layouts of the surrounding area. But closer inspection revealed markings, routes circled, points noted, patterns that suggested surveillance rather than navigation. Some of those markings overlapped with patrol routes. That realization settled heavily over the investigation. This was not a random hiding place. It was not a shelter waiting passively beneath the ground. It was a vantage point, a place from which the town could be observed without being seen. Other items deepened the discomfort. Storage containers held supplies that went beyond what one person would need for a brief stay. There was evidence of planning for duration, water reserves, preserved materials, equipment meant to last, not survivalist clutter, strategic preparation. Still, there was no direct trace of the officers themselves. No badges, no uniforms, no personal items that could be definitively linked to them. That absence was as deliberate as the bunker's construction. It suggested either removal or restraint so precise that nothing was ever left behind. The question shifted from what happened to where the officers fit into the space at all. Investigators revisited the timeline with renewed intensity. The final patrol route, the location of the bunker in relation to where the patrol car's signal had vanished. The overlap was not exact, but it was close enough to matter, close enough to imply intent rather than coincidence. This was the moment when the case fully transformed. For decades, the disappearance had been framed as a mystery born of absence. Now, it became a mystery shaped by presence, by something that had existed all along, unseen, exerting influence without detection. The town reacted in waves. At first, there was shock. The idea that something so substantial could exist beneath familiar land without anyone knowing felt like a violation. People drove past the site differently now, imagining depth where they had once seen only ground. Then came fear. If the bunker had been active, who had used it? And more importantly, were they still around? The discovery did not feel historical in the way old ruins do. It felt recent enough to suggest unfinished business. The families were confronted with a new kind of pain. For years, they had prepared themselves, consciously or not, for the possibility of death. The bunker complicated that preparation. It introduced uncertainty at a scale they had not imagined. The officers had not simply vanished into the night. They had vanished into a system, a structure, a place that implied planning, observation, and control. Hope reemerged, but it was sharp-edged now. If there were no bodies, then absence did not equal death. But absence also did not equal rescue. The space between those possibilities stretched wider than ever. Investigators were careful with what they shared publicly. Every detail risked igniting speculation beyond control. Still, the truth leaked in fragments, carried by rumors and incomplete reports. Theories evolved overnight. Some believed the bunker had been used to detain the officers temporarily, that they had been held, questioned, maybe moved elsewhere. Others believed the bunker was never meant for them at all, but that they had stumbled upon it accidentally and paid the price for seeing something they were never supposed to see. The idea that the officers had interrupted something hidden, that they had crossed into a shadow world running parallel to the town's visible life, took hold powerfully. And yet, there was restraint in the evidence. Nothing inside the bunker screamed criminal enterprise in the traditional sense. No drugs, no weapons caches, no clear indicators of organized crime as people understood it. The space felt quieter than that, more patient, as if it had been waiting rather than operating. This restraint frustrated investigators as much as it intrigued them. The bunker suggested intelligence, foresight, and secrecy, but not motive, and motive was the missing piece. Every object inside seemed to ask a question rather than answer one. Why here? Why this town? Why this level of concealment? And why, after 37 years, had it been left behind rather than destroyed? The last question lingered the longest. If the bunker had been tied to wrongdoing, why hadn't it been erased? Why leave such a risk intact, buried but discoverable? The answer, investigators suspected, lay in the difference between abandonment and obsolescence. Perhaps the bunker had served its purpose. Perhaps whatever operation had required it no longer did. That possibility reframed the disappearance yet again, not as a singular event, but as part of something larger, something that moved on while the town remained frozen in unanswered grief. For the first time, investigators began to consider that the officer's disappearance might not have been the central event at all. It might have been incidental. That idea was almost unbearable. To imagine that 3 lives had been erased not because of who they were, but because of where they happened to be at the wrong moment, because they intersected briefly with a hidden system that could not afford witnesses, challenged every assumption about meaning and justice. The bunker did not solve the case. It deepened it. It stripped away the comfort of randomness and replaced it with intention, while refusing to reveal whose intention had been. It proved that the ground beneath the town had held secrets all along, and that those secrets were capable of swallowing people whole without leaving a mark. As investigators sealed the bunker again, not permanently but provisionally, one truth settled heavily over everyone involved. The disappearance was no longer defined by silence. It was defined by something that had spoken, quietly and directly, but unmistakably, and had left behind more questions than the town had ever known how to ask. The discovery of the bunker did not bring clarity the way people expected. Instead, it fractured the past. What had once felt like a closed chapter, unfinished but settled into its own painful shape, was suddenly unstable again. Timelines that investigators had memorized for decades were pulled apart and laid side by side, no longer trusted to align the way they once had. Assumptions that had hardened into quiet truths began to soften, then crumble. The case was reopened not just procedurally, but psychologically. Every report from the original investigation was reread with a different lens. Notes scribbled in margins 37 years earlier were examined as if they had been written yesterday. Phrases that once seemed mundane, no sign of struggle, no indication of coercion, officers appeared calm, now carried new implications. Calm no longer meant safe. Investigators asked themselves questions they hadn't known how to ask before. Had the officers been observed long before that night? Had their routines been mapped, their habits noted, their predictability exploited? Was a patrol route truly random, or had it intersected with something deliberately hidden? The idea that the officers might not have been targeted personally, but functionally, was deeply unsettling. It suggested that their disappearance was not about who they were, but about what they represented. Interruption, authority, unpredictability in a system that relied on remaining unseen. Old witness statements were re-examined. A report from a resident who had mentioned unfamiliar vehicles parked briefly near the outskirts of town months before the disappearance. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. Now it felt suggestive. Another statement described unusual lights in a field late at night, dismissed then as farm equipment or misidentification. It, too, returned to relevance. Nothing was definitive, but everything felt heavier. Investigators who had once been young were now nearing retirement. Some returned to consult on the case, bringing with them memories that had never fully faded. They spoke of instincts they had ignored because there had been no evidence to support them. Gut feelings that something was wrong. Not chaotic wrong, but methodical. The bunker gave those instincts a place to land. The patrol car's disappearance was revisited with particular intensity. How had a vehicle of that size vanished without trace? Previously, theories had ranged from accident to deliberate destruction. Now, the possibility emerged that it had been moved intentionally, concealed, dismantled somewhere unknown. The question was no longer how something went wrong. It was how much had gone right for whoever orchestrated it. The families were drawn back into the investigation in ways they had not expected or necessarily wanted. They were asked questions again about routines, about conversations, about moments that had once been combed through exhaustively and then left alone. Some answered with patience born of long endurance. Others struggled with resentment. They had lived for decades with the weight of not knowing, and now they were being asked to reopen wounds that had never truly healed. Yet many cooperated anyway, because the bunker had changed the emotional equation. It suggested that the disappearance was not an accident of fate, but an act embedded in intention. And intention implied accountability. Even if it had been delayed by time, the town, too, was forced to reconsider itself. People began looking at familiar places differently. Roads that had always felt benign now seemed layered. The outskirts of town, once dismissed as empty, were reimagined as spaces where things could exist unnoticed. The idea that something so significant could be hidden in plain proximity unsettled deeply held beliefs about visibility and safety. Conversations shifted. Where once people had spoken about the disappearance as a tragedy, they now spoke of it as a breach, not just a law, but of trust in the land, in familiarity, in the assumption that what you see is what exists. Investigators faced an uncomfortable reality. The bunker had raised expectations they might not be able to meet. It suggested answers, but did not provide them outright. It reframed the past without illuminating it fully. The danger was not just that the case might remain unsolved, but that the new context might create the illusion of understanding without delivering truth. Care was taken to avoid that. Experts were consulted from outside the region, specialists in clandestine structures, in historical surveillance operations, in patterns of concealment. Comparisons were made to other cases, other times, other places where hidden infrastructure had intersected with disappearances. None matched perfectly. The bunker resisted categorization. It was too small to be military, too sophisticated to be amateur, too quiet to be criminal in the conventional sense. It sat in an uncomfortable middle ground, defined more by what it wasn't than by what it was. This ambiguity bled into every reinterpretation of the past. Even the final radio call was listened to again, slowed down, filtered, examined with fresh urgency. Investigators listened not for panic, but for distraction, for the sound of attention being pulled elsewhere, for subtle shifts that suggested the officers had noticed something unexpected but not immediately threatening. In that light, the calm tone became more disturbing than comforting. The officers may not have realized they were in danger at all. That possibility haunted the case more than any theory of sudden violence. It suggested a disappearance that unfolded not through force, but through miscalculation, through underestimation, through a moment when professionalism and routine created vulnerability. The families wrestled with this idea privately. It was easier in some ways to imagine an overwhelming event, something unavoidable. Harder to accept that something quiet and controlled might have unfolded while the officers believed they were still in command of the situation. Memory became unreliable. Family members found themselves questioning recollections they had held onto for decades. Small details resurfaced, a comment about an odd patrol assignment, A passing mention of an area that felt off, a half-joking remark about something that didn't sit right. Were those memories real, or had the bunker reshaped them retroactively? No one could say for sure. The investigation moved forward carefully, aware that it was now operating in a space where certainty was rare and overconfidence dangerous. Every step was documented, every conclusion provisional. The goal was no longer just resolution. It was integrity. To understand the disappearance without forcing it into a narrative that felt complete but wasn't. To resist the urge to let the bunker become an answer rather than a question. As months passed, one truth became increasingly clear to everyone involved. The past had not been rewritten by the discovery. It had been exposed as incomplete, and in that incompleteness lay both the possibility of truth and the risk that the town might never fully understand what had happened on that quiet night. Even with concrete walls and hidden rooms now standing as proof that something had been there all along, watching, waiting, and leaving behind only its outline for present to interpret. The bunker was sealed again, this time deliberately, its entrance documented, its existence acknowledged, but its purpose still unresolved. Investigators moved on to other cases. Even as the files remained open in name and in spirit, there were no arrests to announce, no conclusions firm enough to satisfy the weight of decades. The town learned once more how to live with unanswered questions. People returned to their routines, though routine now carried an added layer of awareness. The roads were still driven. The night still felt quiet. But silence no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by memory, by implication, by the knowledge that some things endure without explanation. For the families, closure remained elusive. There was no ceremony that could replace certainty, no marker that could stand in for truth. Grief continued in its unresolved form, shaped not by loss alone, but by possibility. Hope never fully died, but it learned how to stay quiet. The officers remained present in absence. Their names were spoken carefully, with respect, with a restraint born of years spent not knowing how the story ends. Photographs stayed on walls. Chairs remained symbolic. Time moved forward, but not past them. And at night, when patrol cars rolled through town and radios crackled softly with familiar voices, the memory lingered. A reminder that 3 officers once disappeared without a sound, that the ground beneath ordinary places can hold extraordinary secrets, and that some truths do not announce themselves with answers, but with echoes that never quite fade.